Let's make a base.
Hello, I'm Marcel.
And I'm Mrs. Snakeworks.
Now recently, we begun an exciting new project, the Anphelion Project. Our plan is to collect, build and paint the armies, models and scenery of the Anphelion Project, and also play a few of the games in the books, perhaps even as a campaign.
Here's a little link to the series so far.
Now all of our miniatures are going to need basing, and I feel it's important we have bases that fit the theme of the Anphelion Project.
The problem is, what would that theme look like? What would an Anphelion Project base look like?
Now luckily the Anphelion Project book describes the planet and the conditions on it quite well in the planetary survey. Hold on. It's in this book here.
70% of the moon's surface is covered in shallow ammonia swamps. The swamps are formed by submarine geothermic activity from active hydrothermal vents, spewing superheated nitrogen-rich gases into the water depths to form an aqueous solution of nitrogen and hydrogen, ammonia.
So there are rather a lot of the old swamps on Anphelion. Now our battles won't be taking place in those swamps for the majority of the time. So let's have a little look and see what else there is, shall we?
On the higher dry ground, the naturally occurring ammonia in the atmosphere breaks down to leave highly fertile nitrogen deposits. These form the vital nutrients and the components of proteins, nucleic acids, and other cell constituents suitable for plant life and its supporting bacteria, enabling them to flourish. For the moon's ammonia-based flora, these are rich organic compounds that act like fertilizer, allowing the plant life to flourish in areas that are not too wet. On Beta Anphelion IV, the higher ground is commonly covered in dense jungle-like flora.
Okay, so the higher ground, which isn't wet like the old swamps, is a bit drier and is apparently covered in a dense jungle-like flora. Not the margarine. Is that flora? Anyway, when you first hear the word jungle, you probably think predator. Or Jurassic Park.
We can make it if we run.
No, we can't.
Why not?
Because we're being hunted.
Oh, God.
Let's carry on with our research, shall we?
The moon has a wide variety of ammonia-based flora, which flourish on the highly fertile, nitrogen-rich soil. The flora's amino acids are built on liquid ammonia and cesium-based salts, which replace the potassium and sodium-based salts of terrestrial life forms. From this exotic biochemistry, trees, vines and bushes have evolved which do not photosynthesize to the same extent as other flora. They are exposed to very little sunlight or heat and as a result do not contain the chemicals to create the lush green canopies seen on other jungle worlds. Instead, the flora is generally very dark, being predominantly grey, black and brown in colouring, and lacking an abundance of leaf growth. Algae and vine growth is much more common. To untrained eyes, the flora of Beta Anphelion IV would look long dead, shriveled and decaying. In fact, the flora is incredibly hardy, surviving in low temperatures and thriving on the heavy ammonia-rich mists and clouds which also help to feed them.
Okay then, so we have a lot of flora that consists of leafless trees, I guess they would just look like dead trees, vines, bushes, algae, mosses, and other grim-looking plants, I would assume. Now, the book also says there is no wildlife on Anphelion whatsoever, so that would rule out carnivorous plants, because they wouldn't need to evolve there with nothing to eat. So sadly no Venus man traps and big weird things like that. It is a shame, as some of those plants are quite interesting to look at, and they would have been fun to make. If anyone can think of a reason why we might have something like that, then please let us all know in the comments below so we can build one. We need an excuse. Now I have to admit, when I first looked into the old Anphelion project, I did think it was going to be one of the old rainforest type jungles, you know, with the big palm trees and massive ferns and things. Very green, very lush. But a few minutes spent with the old book paints a very different picture. From the description in the book, it sounds very much like Dagobah. Or is it Dagobah? I do like the sound of building some Dagobah themed terrain. We won't be doing a Sunken X-Wing, but we could do a Sunken Valkyrie. That would be bloody brilliant, wouldn't it?
So to make a base, we need a base. We've gone with what I think is a 60mm round base for the purposes of this video. A small one wouldn't be a big enough canvas to experiment on, as it were. And who doesn't like a good experiment?
Oh, I can feel my hair rising. Ow!
Shocking footage there. I'll get my coat.
Right then, to add a little surface variation to the base, we need to add a little texture paste to it. We usually use this stuff, 151 all-purpose filler that comes from cheap tat shops like B&M or QD, but this time it would appear it's gone off inside the container.
That can go in the bin.
Luckily, in my stores, I have a backup, and I have some of this Tesco all-purpose filler. It even comes in a handy squeezy tube, like a big tube of toothpaste. I wouldn't recommend using it to clean your teeth though. Okay, so what we then do is squeeze a little bit out onto the base. For some reason, it won't come out. So it would seem this one went off in the tube too, and is now leaking sticky white goo all down my fingers.
And that one can go in the bin too. So plans A and B have failed. What can we do now?
Luckily, on a recent trip to Asda of all places, Snakeworks Jr. and Marcel found a slab of air drying clay. It is made by Das. Das is gut.
Das ist gut.
Das ist gut. Actually, it's not German, it's Italian. I don't know what das means in Italian. Using the clay, we add a few little mounds, little hills on the base to vary the surface. It felt best to add little bits at a time and work them up rather than just dump a big load on it all at once. It's really fun, but it does make your hands dirty. That's a name of a song I like. Insert footage of Christina Aguilera dirty video.
You didn't need to say that.
Oh. Well then don't underline it.
Here's the clip. I know the moment is gone, but I like to stick to my scripts. Now I myself never liked that song. I found it a bit too rowdy, a bit too raucous. I'd turn it over on the radio if it ever comes on. Everyone seemed to like it back in the day. I think I was the only person that didn't. Anyway, regarding cleaning the clay, you can just wash it off with a bit of water. Comes off very easily.
So after Christina Aguilera has left the building, we have this. A base with wet clay on. Now before it dries, we need to add something to it. We need to add some rock. Now I thought Welcome to the Jungle would be a fitting song indeed. Anyway, let's get this bloody base done, shall we? I have a little collection of slate chunks for basing. We picked a couple of choice pieces out and pressed them into that still wet clay. If it had gone hard, it would have just sat on top. Now, when adding your base decor, always add it in a spaced out manner. Don't just make a big pile of the stuff in the middle of the base, as that just looks really weird. Let me do a little diagram. On the left is how I feel a base should be. A slice of an area of terrain. A little more realistic. On the right is the mound or pile version we sometimes see done. This looks really unrealistic, so I'm not much of a fan of it. It does work for some centerpiece miniatures though. Here you can see me channeling my inner pastry chef. I'm rolling out some thin worms of the clay. I've made 3 as for some reason odd numbers always seem to look better. Does anybody know why that is? I then draped those clay worms onto the base in my attempt at a realistic manner. These are supposed to represent big vines or tree roots or something. I also nipped them off at the edges of the base and smoothed them in with my finger.
Now, for the longest time, I was trying to work out what it was that orange dry clay reminded me of. After a few minutes pondering, I realised it was red Leicester cheese, specifically melted onto toast. And I fancy some cheese on toast now.
To prevent the clay from drying out, not only did we follow the directions on how to seal the packet, but we also wrapped it in cling film. I'm no expert in clay, so this might not actually work, but I'm hoping for the best. Time, as they say, will tell. After a day or so, we left this one on the radiator. The clay had gone off. It was nice and hard. So has it gone to waste then?
What?
The clay?
The clay, right?
Oh, you mean the clay on your model? Right. It had also dried this sort of lighter shade of orange. You could almost call it a lighter shade of pale.
Turn the water, shade of pale.
Oh, so it's a whiter shade of pale. For the longest time, I thought it was a lighter shade of pale. Felix Lighter?
Felix Leiter. Now, what's the CIA doing here?
I think that lighter is spelt differently. I think that's spelt with an E, like later.
We need to add some texture next. I'm going to use this Astro Granite, but you can use anything you like. It doesn't even matter what colour it is, as we're just going to paint over it all at the end. We've painted the entire base with the Astro Granite, but we made sure not to cover the details, like the rocks and the vine worms. You don't have to worry too much about coverage, as it all adds to the natural look at the end. Also, if you get any of the grit on your rim, just rub it off with your finger. Dirty rims look awful. Okay, so a cock-up was almost made here. I grabbed a pot of Agrellan Badland. This wasn't the pot I meant to get. I actually meant to get this, Agrellan Earth. This is the Crackle paint. They both look similar to me, and I always get them confused. I only noticed when I opened the lid.
Again, you can use any Crackle paint you like. Doesn't matter what colour it is, doesn't matter what brand it is. Just use any of them.
Using our Agrellan Earth, we then paint it onto a few areas of the base. We thought it would be clever to apply it to areas that were a little sparser in texture from the previous step. We tried to add this in a random manner, and also try not to go overboard, as is all too often very easy to do. We also added a bit to those Vincem. Vincem? Vincem. Vines?
Vines.
You need to check these. I can't do my job if you don't do yours. We also added a bit to those vines to give them a sort of crackling bark look. I don't know if vines have crackly bark, but these ones do now. We left the Crackle paste to dry overnight, which left us with this. There's a few nice textures in there now. What I have noticed is that applying the Crackle paste to a previous texture gives better results than applying it to bare plastic. When applied to a bare plastic base, it sometimes lifts off and nobody wants that.
Now also, a little tip here, I find it's always best to leave the old Crackle paints to dry naturally. When you go in with the old hairdryer or the heat gun, they always seem to dry in a strange manner. Sometimes they curl up, a bit like the old toenails. And nobody wants a curly Crackle.
The next condiment we are busting out is some PVA glue. This one, by Cascares, is really good. The best PVA glue I've ever tried, and I've tried a few. And apparently, it turns you into James Bond in 10 minutes. So next we're going to need some flock. Not of sheep, but foliage imitation. Word on the street is that it's just dyed sawdust. I'm not sure how true that is, but it might be right, I guess. I keep my flocks in these old takeaway containers that I stole from the Snakeworks in-laws. To apply the flock, we need to paint on some patches of the PVA glue. I like to thin it a little with water so it's easier to apply. When it's neat, it's really thick and goopy. It's very easy to add too much water though, so just add a tiny amount at a time.
Also, I've forgotten to mention, you can stick these patches wherever you like. The more random, the better. Do a lot of reaching around today.
We then sprinkle some of that flock onto the wet PVA glue. The flock, being sawdust apparently, will soak up the glue and harden a bit and stick to the base, giving us some more texture variation. Stupidly, I did this on my desk without putting a sheet or something down to catch the overspill. Hopefully you won't make the same mistake. Here's what the base looks like with the flock added. To me, it looks like scaled down shredded lettuce. I think they use that in filet fish burgers in McDonald's. Mrs. Snakeworks loves those.
I do, they are my favourite. What's my favourite? How can I explain when I don't know what I'm talking about?
When you don't like filet fish burgers.
Oh, okay, I do. They are my favourite, apart from when they are dry. Not very nice then.
The next addition will be some grit. I have this old tub of grit that I stole from my parents' driveway many moons ago. Interestingly, when I run my spoon through it, the reflections and the way the grit falls makes it look like that weird optical effect we see when they show black holes in movies. Is it called gravitational lensing?
Now, I can remember when Mrs. Snakeworks and I saw Interstellar at the old cinema, the old Odeon in Norwich, I believe, and we were both absolutely convinced that the old robots in that were going to be evil. They didn't run like that, did they? They were more like that. They were very good robots and I liked them. Anyway, they didn't turn out to be evil, did they? And that was great.
Much the same as before, we sprinkle some of that grit onto some watered down pea in random patches on the base. It says P! Much the same as before, we sprinkle some of that grit onto some watered down PPA.
PVA! PVA glue!
Look, if you spelt it right, then I'd get it right, wouldn't I? Much the same as before, we sprinkle some of that grit onto some watered down PVA in random patches on the base. We like to add it anywhere all the We like to add it anywhere all the previous steps might have missed. Might have missed. We like to add it. I'm lost. We like to add it anywhere all the previous steps might have missed, filling in any bald spots as it were. This time we remember to do it on top of a plastic lid so Marcel can clean up the overspill easily. Live and learn, eh? Next we dug out our secret box of grass tufts. I think Marcel got some from GW back in the day, and some are some random eBay purchases. The more varied tufts you get, the better, I think. Also, smaller tufts seem to work better as they scale better. This time we used the neat PVA glue, painted on a couple of patches where we wanted the tufts to go, and then pressed the tufts down onto the glue. Marcel used a toothpick to really poke it down in there. Poker, poker, poker!
Now, it might be easier to use the old Superglue for this, as it would dry faster and they won't stand as much risk of peeling off before they've dried.
Now sometimes you get a bit of grit or texture stuck to places you don't want, such as your rim or on the rocks for example. This looks a bit shoddy when it's painted, so it's best to remove it. It comes off really easy with a poking stick. I just used an old toothpick, but you could use anything. It's time for some more plants and bushes. I've had this big bag of lichen for at least 10 years. It's really weird stuff. It's perfect for alien plants. I just grabbed a few bits and tore it down into plant-sized pieces. It's really fragile, so I tried my best to be gentle with them. Can you guess how we apply them to the base? Exactly the same as all the other things. PVA glue. Of the neat variety this time, of course. It doesn't even matter if the glue dries in blobs, as we can just paint over it. It'll just look like moss, or algae, or mud. And here's the base with all the textures and flora applied. I'm really liking it so far. But it does look really weird with all those different colours on, doesn't it? Don't worry, we'll sort that out in the painting stage.
So I was going to leave it there and then begin the old painting, but then something happened.
Now, while out and about with Snakeworks Jr., I found this weird seed pod under a tree. I felt it looked a lot like some sort of alien plant, so I brought it home and gave it a little wash. Amusingly, it looks a lot like the egg from Alien.
Again, like before, we added a good dollop of PVA glue to where we wanted the seed pod. Marcel gave it a good wiggle around to make sure it was well seated into that glue. With that last piece of base decor applied, we had to wait for it all to dry before we could begin painting. So we decided to leave everything to dry overnight.
Now I've actually since found out that seed nut pod is actually a beech nut pod. Any of you out there who might be of the tree expert persuasion probably already knew that. I think the correct term would be an arboreal expert.
During the Christmas break a couple of weeks ago now, we visited the local massively overpriced Winter Wonderland fair. Snakeworks Jr. decided he wanted to drive the cars while I stood there and froze. I do think Mrs. Snakeworks enjoyed it though. Now, after all the base components were dry, I felt it was also a good idea to lock them in. Seal them in, I think, is the correct term for this. To do this, we watered down some PVA glue and just applied it all over the base. It needs to be quite thin so it seeps and soaks into all the nooks and crannies. What even is a cranny? There we go, a soaked base. Amusingly, the dye is leaking out of all the coloured flock things. It reminds me of the Cocoa Pops advert.
Kellogg's Cocoa Pops taste magic, even turns the milk chocolatey, so we'd rather have a bowl of Cocoa Pops.
Now I do enjoy Cocoa Pops, but I prefer Crunchy Nut Cornflakes. Are you really going here? So today's big question. What is your favourite cereal? Is it Crunchy Nut Cornflakes? Is it Cocoa Pops? Is it Rice Krispies? Is it cornflakes? And have you forgotten how good they taste? I have. Now, for reasons unknown...
Not for reasons unknown, I told you.
I didn't film any of the priming of the base. I think I just went outside with the old black primer, my high coat, which says it's matte and it's not. It keeps coming up glossy. Terrible.
It's time to paint. First up, Flat Brown by Vallejo. Is it named after some 1970s apartments? Flat Brown? I'll get my goat. Now we want dark bases, so we used the tried and tested dry brushing method to apply the brown, as opposed to painting the entire base in the brown. We had to be careful around those plants, as we didn't want to rip them off with the brush. Here's that base with the flat brown dry brush applied. I'm happy with the overall colour and also the darkness. I want the miniatures to be the focal point, so the bases need to be as dark as I can get them without sacrificing quality.
I almost want the bases to be a sort of backdrop for the miniatures. I don't want it to overtake them. I want it to be quite subdued.
Return of the bath. We mix a little of this in with a flat brown for a highlight colour. Again, using a dry brush, this one is in fact one of my old makeup brushes. We dry brush on our highlight mix. We apply it a little less heavy than the previous coat. Again, we were careful around the foliage so we didn't tip them off? Rip them off?
Rip them off.
Well, you've actually said ip them off. Here's the base with that first highlight layer applied. It's a nice suitably... Here's the base with that first highlighter... Here's a base with that first highlight layer applied. It's a nice suitable earthy colour, I think.
I do, however, think we need another layer of highlights, just to increase the old contrast a little more.
Again, with the makeup brush dry brush, we apply another layer of the highlight mix. This time we've added a little more of the buff in for a lighter brown tone. Again, Marcel was gentle around the bush. And here we have the finished brown on the base. Although we are happy with the brown and it fits what we need, it does look a bit boring. it's all just one colour.
I feel we need a bit of the old variation.
Right, let's use some lime green, shall we? A nice bright green that isn't too garish. We then dry brush on a few patches of the light green to simulate algae or moss or some other growth. This adds a nice bit of variation in the colours. With our moss and algae applied, the base is already starting to look a lot better. We also watered down the lime green and brushed it on in a few choice places in a random manner. We also hit one of the plants. We can assume this is some sort of branching algae or fungus.
Now we have to be careful we don't use too much of the bright colours or we will stray away from the old subdued dank and grimy look. The dank decaying jungle of Dagobah. We can't even put the jungle animal sound effects in, can we, with no animals? It's a shame. It'll have to be windy. I guess we could put that like wind noise in they have in Aliens.
Buff again. Using the buff quite heavily thinned, we then paint on a few patches of it in random places, mostly on the plants to add a little natural variation. It's time for an experiment with flat red. Wish us luck. We then do the same again with the flat red to add another colour onto the base. Marcel did go back with some water and blend the more stark patches out. Before then, it looked more like graffiti.
Now the Fresh Prince always reminds me of my childhood when me and my dear mother used to sit around the table around 6 PM every weekday evening waiting to watch Fresh Prince, and then afterwards it would be Star Trek The Next Generation, I believe, and then The Simpsons, or those things just in a different order. We'd always sit and have our dinner while watching them. Nostalgia hits hard with those ones. It was probably like the mid to late 1990s? I can't remember. I've slept since then.
Now here we have the base with the colours applied, and although I do like it, I feel they are still a bit stark, and we can do a little more to that to fix it, you know? So next up we take those 3 colours we love and thin them all right down into very thin washes. Using our new washes, we then add some patches, again randomly, onto the base. We also concentrate on areas where the colours are too bright, or we have hard, defining edges, to sort of blend and tie things together. With those washes on, I think the base now looks a lot more natural, a lot more in keeping with the theme of the project.
Now I did like the base at that point, and I felt we could have left it there, but I had just a couple more bits that I wanted to add.
We are going to mix black and flat brown together to make a very dark brown and then thin it rather a lot. Using this dark wash, we apply it to any areas we feel need a little variation or darkening, using it almost as a filter in some places and a pin wash in others. This helped reinforce the darker and shadowed areas on the base. With those dark washes applied, the main part of the base was almost finished. We just have to wait for those washes to dry. Drying is when it is no longer wet.
Thanks for the tip. Now I left it to dry on the old radiator, this one here, and that was pretty helpful in speeding things along with drying times. Now if you would like to discuss different methods of drying things, then please feel free to join us on our friendly Discord server, which is not locked behind a paywall. I'll put a little link up here somewhere, and there's also one down in the description below.
It's the Vallejo Black now, the one with the wrinkly label, for reasons unknown.
Not for reasons unknown, I told you.
It's now the time for a rimming session. We thin the black until it's nice and smooth, then paint the entire rim of the base with the black. We try our best not to get any paint on the top detail. Take your time when rimming, as a tidy rim really does look nice. After the first layer was dry, we also applied another couple of thin coats.
You have to keep Duncan Rhodes happy, don't you? He'll come knocking on your door and say, "Oi! I don't see 2 thin coats on there." Anyway, talking of being happy, if you're enjoying this video, then please consider liking it and subscribing to the channel. That means you, Sam. And remember, Mrs. Snakeworks has said that when we hit 10,000 subscribers, we're allowed to order a Warhound Titan. So please hit that subscribe button and we can smash that target ASAP. If you are enjoying the content on the channel, then please consider joining us on Patreon. Again, there's a link up here somewhere, and there's also one down in the description below. Or you could even use one of those links to become a channel member, which is much more popular these days, I believe.
While we put our paints away, just want to give a big loving shout out to all our channel members and patrons. Dan Yallop, Lee Blackley, Donald, Pine Tree, Bobzilla, Charles Marlowe, Andrew Marrington, Dr. Lee, Nick Ellingham, Briars and Bantams, and our newest member, Tim Van Stralen. Thank you all so much for supporting us. We love you all.
We really do. Without further ado, let's check out the finished article, shall we?
And here we have it, the all-built, painted and finished Anphelion Project Base.
We are really happy with how it's turned out. We've managed to keep the dank, dreary look, while still keeping some colour and texture variation in there.
I do think maybe the beech nut pod was a little too big for the base, and maybe we won't add such sizable nuts in the future, but as it's only a test base, it doesn't matter.
The base was really easy to do and a lot of fun, so we're really looking forward to rolling this basing scheme out onto all of the Anphelion Project miniatures. We can't wait to see you again.
It's infantry time next. If you want to see more videos in this Anphelion Project series, then check out the playlist up here somewhere. And as always, thank you very much for watching.